mentioned, my name is Sarah Judd-Lam, and I'm the Executive Manager of the Policy, Research and Projects team at Carers New South Wales. I'll be presenting today on behalf of myself, as well as my colleague Grace Cherrington, and also our colleagues at the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, and the membership of our Carer Rights and Complaints Network, which I'm going to speak about. And today I'm going to be speaking about the Carer Rights Education project that Carers New South Wales is leading under the New South Wales Carers Strategy. In line with this session's focus, the Carer Rights Education project is about helping carers to understand what can be very complex complaints processes in order to uphold their rights. Next slide, please. So just a bit brief overview of my presentation. I'm going to touch briefly on carer recognition legislation in New South Wales. I'm also going to talk about the establishment of the Carer Rights and Complaints Network that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to touch briefly on carer rights and complaints in New South Wales more broadly. And then I'm going to speak about the specifics of our projects relating to fact sheets and webinars on rights for carers. And then finalise the presentation by talking about next steps. Next slide, please. So it's important, first of all, to speak about the New South Wales Carers Recognition Act 2010, which provides some context for the information that I'm going to present. Some of you may be aware of the Act, others may not. It's definitely worth investigating. It's a piece of legislation in New South Wales that's very helpful in identifying what government should be doing to support carers. So as you can see from this slide, the objects of the New South Wales Carers Recognition Act are to enact a carers charter that recognises the role and contribution of carers, and to increase awareness of the valuable contribution that carers make to our community. The Act covers a few different things, but some of its key provisions include defining carer, establishing the New South Wales Carers Advisory Council, and establishing obligations for New South Wales public sector agencies regarding some key principles around carers, which are on my next slide. So the New South Wales Carers Charter is Schedule 1 of the Act, and that is a set of key principles that are best practice in supporting carers. And so these principles are things that New South Wales government agencies, in particular human service agencies, are expected to uphold in their delivery of services to carers and in their employment of carers. It is important to note that the Act that includes the Carers Charter does not actually create legal rights for carers. So these principles and the obligations for government agencies are not really enforceable through formal complaints mechanisms. And that's a whole other conversation in itself, but that's really the key reason why it's important for us to look at other legislation and policy in New South Wales when seeking to understand carer rights. And it really also provides the grounding for the reason for the Carer Rights Education project. Next slide, please. So the reason for bringing the Act into this context is actually that the review of the Act in 2016 was central to the establishment of the Carer Rights Education project. And as you can see from this slide, a key recommendation of the review in 2016, which Carers New South Wales contributed a submission to, was to improve information for carers about complaints mechanisms, which really is about reducing complexity for carers, the topic of this session. And so that the action coming out of that recommendation was the establishment of the Carer Rights and Complaints Network between Carers New South Wales in partnership with the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, or DCJ. Next slide, please. So the action associated with improving information for carers about complaints mechanisms was to establish the Carer Rights and Complaints Network, or CRCN. CRCN has been by Carers New South Wales in partnership with DCJ since late 2017, with the first formal meeting occurring in early 2018. And the aim of the group was really to bring key stakeholders together in order to improve understanding across the board about carer rights and complaints, both among carers and also within the complaint sector. The agreed work plan of the group was to first map carer rights and complaints across the key sectors, and then to summarise this information in a format that carers could easily understand and access to support them having their rights upheld and accessing complaints mechanisms. Next slide, please. So as you can imagine, the CRCN started in 2018. It's now 2021. Our membership has changed a little bit over time. Some of our initial members are no longer involved formally. Similarly, we've had some additional members join along the way. So this is not a comprehensive list, but our key members formally across that period are listed on the slide. I won't go through them in detail, but as you can see, a number of them are state-based, but there's also some Commonwealth agencies there. And you'll also see a mix of complaints agencies as well as other organisations involved in rights, such as peak organisations. Next slide, please. So this slide, without going into detail, is just to give you a spattering, I guess, of prior work on carer rights that Carers New South Wales had undertaken before the CRCN was established. So it wasn't the first time we had started looking at carer rights as a topic. We'd been working on it for a number of years, particularly in the context of the NDIS and disability rights. So without looking at those specifically, there's a bunch of prior work that addressed what rights carers have and to the extent to which these are enforceable. And it's a particularly complex area given what I said before about the New South Wales Carers Recognition Act. While being a great act, doesn't really create enforceable rights for carers. And so the concept of carer rights and complaints in that area is limited. And so we needed to look outside of that act in understanding carer rights and complaints opportunities. Next slide, please. So the first step for the CRCN as a group was to map carer rights and complaints across a range of sectors that are commonly accessed by carers. And anyone that's working with carers or who is a carer themselves will understand just how many service systems that carers access on a day-to-day basis. Most of those systems are very complex on their own, let alone in combination with others. And I think most of you would probably agree that carers tend to access more complex service systems than non-carers as a whole. It might be a combination of accessing the NDIS to access disability support, while also accessing Centrelink and also accessing perhaps the social housing system. There's a whole range of systems that carers navigate. And it's really important to try and reduce that complexity to reduce stress for carers and also to improve service access and outcomes. So this slide just has the key areas that we identified as a group where legislation or policy already was existing that created rights or entitlements for carers that could be upheld through formal mechanisms and pathways, as opposed to the New South Wales Carers Recognition Act, which is a more aspirational piece of legislation. There are a number of pieces of legislation where there's specific rights for carers that can be upheld through formal mechanisms, and that's what our focus was for this project. Next slide, please. So this slide, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read the detail, it's just a screenshot of an early iteration of a stakeholder map that we developed. And this was part of our mapping the complaints landscape for carers in identifying the many different organisations that are able to help carers with complaints. And you can see there are a lot there. It's often hard to understand who does what. And so we really wanted to raise awareness among the complaint sector, but also among carers of who's out there, but also who the best points of call are for particular kinds of issues. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the next slide here really identifies the common settings that we wanted to address in the resources that we were eventually going to develop for carers. So once we as a group had a firm understanding of the key carer rights and complaints options and had mapped those, it was really important to us as a group and to Carers New South Wales in particular, as the peak organisation for carers, that we put this information into a format that was actually going to be useful for carers and as easy to understand as possible. So it was a pretty complex exercise that we undertook working together as a group, working closely with the relevant complaints agencies to really distill the key information that needed to be in these resources. We decided that we were going to do a series of 8 fact sheets, 1 introductory fact sheet to the project, and then 7 on those common settings that are listed on the slide. We decided to go with common settings as a way to approach the topics because carers may not start with the point of view of the jurisdictions of complaints agencies, which is how we often start in the sector, but they are more likely to start with the actual situation that they're in and what kind of service they're accessing. So those were the focus topics that we looked at, and it was really important to us that we keep these fact sheets as brief as possible. So they were going to be maximum 2 pages. We wanted to include common elements across the fact sheets, including a case study, And we really wanted to keep the language and also the explanations around the complaints pathways as straightforward as possible, which, again, anyone working in the complaint sector or with the complaint sector will understand that's a very hard ask. So it took a long time with a lot of people assisting, but we were able to develop what we think are really effective and brief fact sheets on these different topic areas. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we had 8 brief fact sheets. The one that's pictured there is the introductory fact sheet, which is just 1 page, and that overviews the project. I've mentioned some of the key principles there already, focusing on common scenarios. Another really important thing to us was that we, if there were multiple options for a particular complaint, that we actually choose just to feature the best option. And the way that we defined the best option was by prioritizing services or contact numbers where we could be guaranteed that carers would be warm referred elsewhere if it wasn't the right place to land, and with services that we were working with closely that we knew could advise on the best way forward for carers. So we really tried to simplify the information as much as we could and not just include every possible option. And towards the end of each fact sheet, we also wanted to include wherever we could options where carers could actually go for specific support in navigating those systems. So in the context of aged care, that was the Older Persons Advocacy Network, for example. And so there is a link there where it's a shortened link just because the original link is long, but there's a link there where you can read about the project and also download those fact sheets if you're interested. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the next slide speaks about the 8 related webinars. One of the things that we wanted to do following those fact sheets being completed was ensure that we were able to transmit that information in different formats to maximise carers' access to the information. And we were also conscious that the fact sheets are pretty brief and they don't go into a lot of detail on particular areas of rights and complaints and jurisdictions. So what we decided to do as a group was to jointly deliver 8 associated webinars that linked in topic and also consecutive order to the fact sheets that could accompany them and be recorded as additional resources. And so these were held monthly until last month, and they were on Wednesday lunchtimes. We usually co-delivered with 1 or 2 CRCN member organisations on the relevant topic, and they drilled down a little bit further into their own organisations' jurisdictions with the aim of really putting a face to the support that is available and the options that are available to carers in those areas. We also had pre-submitted questions that were able to be discussed to tease out some commonly arising issues. The turnout was relatively small, but as they were intended to be recorded sessions, we were happy with that. We had pretty high registration numbers, and those are publicly available on our YouTube channel for people to tune into later. And so those are completed now and really are accompanying resources to the fact sheets. Next slide, please. So the Carer Rights Education Project, as it's now known, is really the continuation of the important work that was commenced with these complaints agency partners of ours in really just raising awareness around carers in the complaint sector and also upskilling carers in navigating the very complex complaints systems. And so it was really great to have this project recognised in the new Carers Strategy, which was released in October last year, this time last year in Carers Week. And again, if you're not familiar with the New South Wales Carers Strategy, it's really worth looking that up. And I've included a link on the slide there to where you can download the action plan, which is also pictured on this slide. And the action plan, which is the first 2-year action plan associated with the 10-year Carers Strategy, includes a number of projects. And one of the projects is Carer Rights Education, and it's the project led by Carers New South Wales. So now that we've finished the resources that we had set out to establish under the Carer Rights and Complaints Network, we're at the next phase of looking at what next. There's plenty of capacity to develop more resources, and there's plenty of capacity to bring in additional stakeholders. And so this project will be continuing, perhaps in a slightly different form. And the last point there is important to highlight that actually next week we are having a public stakeholder workshop to discuss those next steps, and you're invited. So the next slide, please. And this is really my last content slide before questions. So the stakeholder workshop, just to let you know, is part of the free events that Carers New South Wales is putting on next week to recognise National Carers Week. And if you are interested in further conversations on this topic, lunchtime Friday, the 15th of October, You can register now on the Carers New South Wales website at that link included below. And we are going to really have an interactive workshop to talk through emerging issues in carer rights, looking at any gaps and opportunities in the existing resources, and identify some key priorities to move forward. And we invite all kinds of stakeholders, including complaints agencies, service providers, and carers, to join us for that event and contribute to the next phases of this project. And so the next slide is my last slide with my contact details. And that's all from me today, unless there's any questions. So I'm just having a look at the questions that have come through here. So I have a question about what happens when public service agencies don't first help carers and second allow HR and IR performance management instruments to be used. Okay, so it's a bit of a long question. So I guess the crux of this question probably speaks back to what I said before about the New South Wales Carers Recognition Act being an aspirational piece of legislation that has obligations for public sector agencies, but is not really attached to a formal complaints mechanism that would allow to enforce legally enforceable rights. So the New South Wales Carers Recognition Act 2010, as I mentioned earlier, does create obligations for public sector agencies to consult with carers, to recognise the principle charter in terms of their HR, as this question is highlighted, and also to, in designing and delivering services, take heed of and reflect the principles of the New South Wales Carers Charter. So I guess the question is getting at what happens if that is not the case, given that it doesn't create legally enforceable rights, and it's a very good question. So the benefit of having legislation like this is that it does give you something to point to when you're having those initial conversations with the person responsible for the issue that's arisen. So whether it's in the employment context, if it's in the service delivery context, if you know that an organisation is not actually delivering their obligations under the New South Wales Carers Charter, the principles in the Charter, you can absolutely raise the legislation with them. Not all public sector agencies are aware of their obligations. I know DCJ has been working hard for a number of years to raise awareness, but it's worth raising that. And it gives you a platform to have a formal conversation around what that could look like. And then while there's not sort of an explicit complaints mechanism, Carers New South Wales is the peak non-government organisation for carers in New South Wales. And we're able to raise through a number of avenues in formal committees, through submissions, issues that carers are finding arise in the services sectors. So if there's no progress with talking to the people involved around the Carers Recognition Act, you're always welcome to contact our policy team. And the policy team looks at issues that are arising for carers, and then we can do systemic advocacy, so not individual advocacy, but we can raise broad issues with government that may need to be addressed in certain areas, certain service areas. So that's really something to consider. But as always, with all of the complaints work, really encourage those direct conversations to be had with the people involved, and then escalation within the organisation as appropriate. And I think we only had one other question there. So, yep, so the other question was around the public sector as well. So again, it really is something within your workplace that needs to be managed within the workplace. But if it's a systemic issue, you're welcome to raise with the policy team. So I think that was all the questions, unless there was anything else, Wendy, that you wanted to ask.
No, I think there was a comment on what a fantastic presentation you just delivered, Sarah, so thank you.
Thank you.
And I can say from personal resources are fantastic. They're very easy to read. Everything's spelt out quite clearly for carers, and the webinars help talk people through the detail of those fact sheets as well. So very, very helpful resource.